So, let me say it again, Cam. I may be a superhero, but I'm also just a man who fell in love with the wrong woman. Just a man who fell for the wrong woman. Fell for the wrong woman. But out of crisis comes change. Out of crisis comes change. So I spent the last year really slowing down and reconnecting with myself. And I am very excited for everyone to meet the real me.
Amazon Prime's show The Boys has recently wrapped up its third season, and it's proving to be more popular than ever. The series, which started in 2019, revolves around the simple concept of real-world superheroes, using parodies of commonly known heroes such as Superman and Captain America to show how those types of people would act in a mundane world, and more specifically, how they would be commodified and corrupted by capitalism in the form of the Vought Corporation. Our main characters are made up of members of the premier superhero team, the Seven, as well as the group dedicated to fighting these supes and keeping them in check, the Boys. The series exploded onto the scene when it premiered and has stayed relevant ever since, but just like the superhero media that it parodies, it is not an original work, but rather an adaptation of a comic book. Today, I want to take a look at The Boys as a whole, both the comic and the show, in order to examine what made it relevant back during the comic's original release, and what continues to make it relevant enough to be as successful as the show is today. To start, let's take a brief look at the history of the comic series itself. The original series ran from October 2006 to November 2012, created by writer Garth Ennis and artist Derek Robertson. Ennis is known for his work on series such as Preacher, Hitman, Hellblazer, and Punisher, while Robertson is known for his work on Transmetropolitan, a variety of different Marvel and DC superhero comics, and the series Happy. Originally, the comic was distributed by a company called Wildstorm, which was a subsidiary of DC, but it was cancelled after only 6 issues because DC was not a huge fan of the vehement anti-superhero agenda, as one might imagine. Speaking during an interview with Publisher Weekly, Ennis said that, "I think if I were to sum it up in one line, it would be that you can have comics where people do awful things to each other like Preacher, but you can't have a comic where super people do awful things to each other." Afterwards, the series was picked up by Dynamite Entertainment for the rest of its 72-issue run. In order to fully understand the inspiration for The Boys, we need to understand the world that it came from. This period of time in the 2000s saw an unprecedented amount of growth in the comic book industry, but it wasn't exactly distributed very well, with superhero comics taking the majority of this newfound profit. In that period of the mid to late 2000s, superhero comics had a chokehold over the comic book industry. Superhero comics had been growing in sales year after year, to the point where in the mid-2000s, they alone were worth nearly $500 million in that industry, which doesn't seem like much to today's standards, but in the mid-2000s, with such a minute and niche industry like comic books, that was almost complete domination. The dominance of this superhero genre in the medium is what directly inspired the series, because as anyone who has seen a single episode of the show or who has read a single issue of the comic can tell you, Garth Ennis hates superheroes. In fact, Garth Ennis is more than happy to talk about that himself. Speaking to Sci-Fi Now in 2012 after the series had concluded, Ennis said, "I find most superhero stories completely meaningless. Which is not to say I don't think there's potential for the genre. Alan Moore and Warren Ellis have both done interesting work with the notion of what it might be like to be and think beyond human, see Miracle Man, Watchmen, Super Gods. But so long as the industry is geared towards fulfilling audience demand, i.e. for the same brightly colored characters doing the same thing forever and ever, you're never going to see any real growth. The stories can't end, so they'll never mean anything." The hatred Ennis felt towards the superheroes that were taking over the comic book medium, combined with his own personal views on how superheroes would be in the real world, is what led to the creation of The Boys. Speaking on this in 2006, Garth said, "My own take on superheroes is that if they really existed, they'd be somewhere between movie stars and politicians. They'd be movie stars because they'd be glamorous and fabulous looking, and people would follow their lives exactly as if they were reading fictional adventures. But they'd be like politicians because they'd have a genuine and tangible effect on our lives and our world." Hearing this, it's not exactly surprising to discover that the original comic was very, very heavy-handed with its commentary and social critiques, and was actually relatively popular during its original run, earning several different award nominations throughout the late 2000s, and the finale selling around 20,000 units in its first month, which, not bad for an independent comic at the time. Although the comic is filled with different aspects that have not aged super well or were just bad to begin with in several different ways, there's still somewhat of a cult following for the original comic, which it had since its premiere. And this isn't hard to see why. It's not hard to imagine that a lot of people felt similar to how Garth did, that superheroes were everything and everywhere in the comics industry, and to see a series that was just intensely hateful towards them and dedicated to bringing about their downfall was certainly refreshing. This sentiment started growing in the perfect time to lead us to where we are today with not just the boys but superheroes as a whole. The meteoric rise of the MCU and the kind of colossal failure of the DCU throughout the mid-2010s led to more and more people feeling this same sort of feelings. Feeling that superheroes were kind of overstaying their welcome, were boring and repetitive, and the same things that permeated the comic book industry and led to the rise of The Boys as a comic is exactly what led to the rise of The Boys as a show in the late 2010s. Although the show premiered in 2019, that wasn't the first time the comic had tried to be adapted into the live action. A movie was actually optioned in 2008, but it was kinda in development hell for 5 years with here and there updates about director changes, studio changes, and the last update being in April of 2013. Then, radio silence until the show was announced nearly 5 years later. And when it came back in force. The show began in 2019, and it absolutely dominated the scene, becoming an instant hit from Amazon Studios and the only reason to keep the Prime streaming service, in my opinion. It ended up being renewed for Season 2 before Season 1 even premiered, to show you the level of confidence Amazon had in it, and has led to an animated spin-off called The Boys Diabolical, as well as an upcoming live-action spin-off titled Generation V. And don't get me wrong, there's something kind of ironic and something to be said about a show that critiques superfluous additions and superheroes encompassing the world, kind of expanding into the realm of spin-offs and cartoons, but we'll save that for another time. The main takeaway for now is the idea that this idea that was once just a very small and uncommon little niche in the comic book industry has become more and more prevalent in our everyday lives. Because, well, for the simple reason of the superhero market itself has become more and more prevalent. Just like Butcher shows Huey in the first episode of the series, there's constantly all of these different movies and TV shows and merchandise that is just assaulting us every day no matter where we go or what we do. And it's not hard to see why some people can get sick of that eventually. Superheroes have dominated media over the last 10 years, and whether or not they're actually aware of it, people may find themselves growing kind of tired of it. There's just too much content, too many heroes, too many shows, too many movies. I mean, for crying out loud, the MCU just recently surpassed 100 hours of content, which is insane. And this environment is the perfect seeding ground for The Boys to be as successful as it is. The Boys could not have timed its release better, because not only was it during a time that was oversaturated with this, but it was almost immediately after the release of Avengers Endgame. Mere months after the culmination of everything Marvel has built in their superhero empire over the course of nearly 11 years, here comes The Boys to tell you, the consumer, that yeah, there are a lot of superhero stuff going on right now. Maybe it's a bit too much. Maybe we need something different. And a standard run-of-the-mill, gritty comic book adaptation or depraved superhero isn't really different anymore. Stuff like the DC universe and the Marvel universes have already started to dip their toes into that, and not to mention older films like Sin City. We've had all that stuff before. But where The Boys sets itself apart is its critique, its commentary. Because The Boys isn't just about superheroes, it's about how superheroes are flawed and how we are flawed in consuming them. The Boys is reliant on not just critiquing our world and consumerism and the capitalism that drives it, but also the media that we consume in our own world. And one of the main points is that even though they're not real, superheroes may own our world just as much as they own the world of The Boys. And it's gotten to such a point that even people involved with these projects are starting to talk about how kind of run-of-the-mill and just industry bait they are. Ethan Hawke, who played the villain in the Moon Knight Disney Plus series, was quoted as saying, "If you're an actor in the 1950s, they made westerns. But if you're an actor in the 2020s, you've got Marvel," likening them to just a job that anyone in the industry has to do at some point or another. And with the continued success of anything and all things superhero for the most part, there's no reason to assume that this would change or stop at all in the near future, leaving the parts of everyday life that aren't already being consumed by this expansion to grow smaller and smaller. And that is what makes the show such a great adaptation of the comic, because the comic was, yes, a very biting social and critical commentary, but it was a critical commentary on the world and the industry and the time that it was written. In the comic industry of the mid to late 2000s, you can't have a commentary or critique on that in the modern day because that's just not what the world or the industry is like anymore. If The Boys had done a very direct one-to-one adaptation, it wouldn't have worked for that exact reason. The world has changed, and the changes that they made in the adaptation to The Boys have allowed them to critique not the old world that the comic is from, but the new world that we live in today. The show has made many, many, many changes from its source material, most of which are definitely for the better, but they're not really done just for the sake of spicing up the story so fans don't know what's coming next. They're done to update it for a modern world. Like I said, it's changed. Everything is different now. So the series has to be different in order to actually have a notable and important critique. It has to change if it still wants to have something to say. And who knows what's going to happen with the future of The Boys. The societal commentaries from the comic really don't apply as much anymore. And that's why the adaptation had to update. And in all honesty, the same thing will probably happen 10 to 15 years from now. Society is going to change. The world will be different. And the critiques and commentary from The Boys are on contemporary society. So it's entirely possible, more so probable, that it's just not going to apply down the line. But that's the hallmark of a good adaptation. You want to see what the old version was trying to say, how it critiqued its surroundings, and you want to carry that message forward by updating it to your current surroundings. And The Boys has done an absolutely fantastic job of that. The ability of the creators to update not just the plot and characters, but also the critique and commentary to fit a modern audience is the key to the continued relevancy of The Boys.
I mean, they fucking love me.